The focus today for me as an investor is the question is always, is this a long lasting brand? The environment today, I would say it's pretty different from when I first entered early stage consumer investing. I think that the focus now is on sustainable growth and profitability. But I would say, listen, consumer isn't going anywhere. Great brands are built every day. There's brands that are built, there's consumer products, businesses to invest in. A long lasting consumer brand isn't built overnight. The cost of customer acquisition, it was quite a bit cheaper a decade ago. I may be a minority, but I don't actually care to see that they got to like 2 million or 3 million within the first year, 2 years. Like, to be honest, that's always kind of scared me when I've seen that level of like quick growth really, really, really early on. And I think what you're realizing, what you're seeing today is that not all the growth is sustainable, right? But it's just there's like loyalty has become really important to me. And that is to me a marker of a brand with long lasting abilities.
Hello, I'm your host, Mike Gelb, and this is The Consumer VC, where we discuss the intersection of venture capital and consumer innovation. This show is brought to you by Propeller Industries, the leading strategic finance and accounting partner for venture stage companies. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe on YouTube or Spotify or Apple, wherever you're listening to this content. That would be tremendous. Also, if you're really loving this show, I highly recommend checking out the email newsletter at theconsumervc.com. I share all the latest fundraisers in the world of consumer. And also, you'll be the first to know when a new episode drops. All content and episodes are for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not investment advice. Thank you, Luke Vernon, for the introduction to our guest today, Manica Blain. Manica is the founder of Topknot Ventures. She's an advisor, investor, board member to early stage consumer brands. Previously, she co-founded Campfire Capital, whose notable investments were leading the $5 million Series A for Figs in 2016, and for being a meaningful investor in both of Cotopaxi's Series A and Series B rounds. Even though I just mentioned two apparel companies, we primarily focus this conversation on Manica investing in beauty and personal care companies and why now is a really interesting time. And also the past couple of years have also been really interesting times to invest in beauty and personal care, and why that's one of her main focuses today. Without further ado, here's Manica. Manica, thanks so much again for coming on the podcast. I know we've been wanting to do this for some time, and now we finally got the opportunity, and it's so great to reconnect. How are you?
I'm good. I'm likewise. I'm really happy to be here.
You've been in consumer your entire career. I believe it started with you reaching out to Lululemon, just saying, "Hey, I'm here. I'm here," and you being so amazed by that business. And of course, I'd imagine that you've seen from the investment lens, consumer as an investable category kind of have its ups and downs over the past few years. Can you describe the pulse of investing in emerging consumer brands today from an investment lens?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I actually started my career in investment banking. I've actually never worked for Lululemon. This is a little known fact. I reached out to them looking for a job. They didn't actually eventually they never hired me, but eventually I collaborated with some other former executive to start a fund. So that's the Lululemon chapter.
Okay.
But no, the environment today, I would say it's pretty different from when I first entered early stage consumer investing, which would have been in the 2014, 2015, 2016 era. I would say today the climate is, I think there's still a lot of appetite, but it's certainly, the tone has come down a bit in terms of all the excitement and what you thought a consumer brand could achieve and the time it could achieve. I think that those expectations have changed. I think that the focus now is on sustainable growth and profitability much sooner than it was, call it a decade ago. But I would say, listen, consumer isn't going anywhere. Great brands are built. Every day, there's brands that are built. There's consumer products, businesses to invest in. I would say investors are they've become, I would say, much more discerning than they ever have been before, at least since I've been in the early stage space for about the last decade.
So since you've been in the early stage space in the last decade, let's talk about your own kind of expectations for consumer brands when you were starting out versus now. Have they changed? I know that right now there's certainly you certainly hear like an outcry. You got to get profitable, and let's see about how you can actually grow sustainably, as you just pointed out, or think about even organic growth versus paid growth, or when you're doing paid, is it actually sustainable, and are you getting the actual return on your ad spend? But how have you seen, like, how have like your expectations of on the investment side maybe changed, or have they been kind of the exact same in some ways because you always have like been in consumer?
I mean, I think what I've always known is that a long-lasting consumer brand isn't built overnight. I think I've always known that and I've always seen that. I think the difference between the climate that we find ourselves in today versus the climate that you may have been in a decade ago is that the cost of customer acquisition was quite a bit cheaper a decade ago, and even a few years ago. And so I think the focus today for me as an investor is, the question is always, is this a long lasting brand, right? And I'm not, I may be a minority, but I don't actually care to see that they got to like 2 million or 3 million within the first year or 2 years. Like, to be honest, that's always kind of scared me when I've seen that level of like quick growth really, really, really early on. Because to me, it's been like, okay, so you've just acquired all your customers, right? Like it hasn't so no, but seriously, I mean, that's the reality, right? Like, I've always, to be honest, the brands I'm most attracted to um, are the brands where it's taken a little while for them to build their base and to figure out their unit economics and to figure out product market fit. And once they figured that out, they've been putting the fuel in the tank to really grow and gas up that growth. Like, that to me has always made a lot more sense. Um, and I think what you're realizing, what you're seeing today is that not all of the growth is sustainable, right? And so when you grow at a really, really quick clip early on because you're putting a lot of cash into the acquisition machine, the economics just don't work today. We all know that. But it's just, there's like, loyalty has become really important to me, right? And that is to me a marker of a brand with long lasting abilities.
What's typically your entry point for brands? Not even like on the investment side, maybe, but even just in terms of engaging conversations, or even when you're thinking of yourself, could this be, a long lasting brand? Is there something really here?
I love engaging early. As an investor, I personally like coming in when a brand is already doing at least somewhere between $500,000 to $1 million in sales, at least. I'm not my strategy isn't to, invest like pre-launch, pre-rev, like that's not where I get the most, because I do like to see a bit of traction. I like to understand who their consumer is. I like to see them know who their customer is as well. So I'm not as early as pre-revenue, pre-launch. Like, I do like to see traction. I guess the difference between maybe how I look at things and how another investor might look at it. And I have a lot of friends that have their own funds and that invest in the early stage. And a lot of them will be very explicit and be like, within year one, I want to see $1 million in sales. And I'm like, cool, you do you. But I'm actually most attracted to the brands where I call them sleepers. I don't know if that's a good way to define them or not, but I'm most attracted to brands sometimes where they emerge. It takes them a little while. They're really they're iterating on their products sometimes. They're iterating on who their consumer actually is, and then they find it, and then they grow. I think that, to me, that I get really excited about businesses like that.
Do you happen to have any examples when it comes to, brands that maybe took a while to figure out, whether it's their positioning, whether it's who their kind of target market is, but
Yeah,
you
I have
thought there was
two. I
kind of
have two
something?
actually that
Yeah.
come to mind. Yeah, I have two that I can talk about. They're both in my portfolio and they both come to mind. One is a business called Sahajan. It's an Ayurvedic beauty brand. Lisa Matam is a former pharma exec, and she started the business at the end of 2015. And back when people probably couldn't even pronounce or spell the word Ayurveda, and it's a market that she was really, really early in, probably too early, to be honest. And she grew, and it was small, and it was the first couple of years, and it always grew, but it was small, it was tiny. And then she had this magic moment in 2020 where I think it was an editor of Oprah magazine, or someone within that, Oprah, whatever, and they called one of her core products her brightening mask, like her favorite thing to do during the pandemic. And then all of a sudden, like, God bless Oprah, and that whole brand, but the business just like, it sort of, all of a sudden it was on the scene. And, and it's an interesting one because she was actually a part of Sephora's first Accelerate program back in 2016, right?
Wow.
Yeah, the very first Sephora Accelerate. And so she cultivated that relationship with Sephora over time as well. And, as any beauty brand, aspiring brand, she'd probably been trying to get into a brand or retailer like that. But that door didn't actually open for her until very recently. She launched at Sephora.ca here in Canada about 6 weeks ago. And it's been for me the definition of what a successful launch looks like within a retailer like that. Multiple sellouts within the first 10 days, sold out of every single one of her 10 or 7 SKUs. And it's interesting because when Sephora all of a sudden sold out on their site, she saw a surge of new customer growth on her own site, on like Sahajan.com. And that told me and her that this is interesting, that the demand for the products that I'm creating, whether it be the ingredients, moringa, like all of amla, like all of these ingredients that her products have, like the market for it is clearly, the demand is there for it now. And it wasn't there maybe a decade ago. She was clearly too early back in 2015, 2016, 2017. But through that period of time, as she built her brand, I think 2 things happened. A, the market developed, the demand, that has happened. If you look at the market today, I can name 15 different Ayurvedic beauty brands that exist in the market, all great brands, but she was kind of there from the beginning.
She was the first.
She was one of the first, right? And I think the other thing is that in that time, she had the ability to really build her consumer base, and she's developed a really, really powerful and loyal community. I led a round for her last summer, and it was totally oversubscribed. We were in and out of the market in 4 weeks. And one of the biggest, like I would say, interest points as the investors drilled in was just how valuable and recurring her loyal customer base was. Like, I think like 15 to 20% of her lifetime value net sales came from customers that had purchased 10 times or more. I don't know about you, but I can't think of too many brands where I've like gone online, I've shopped like 10 times or more. Like, and as you start to drill into that ultra VIP customer, I mean, this isn't just somebody ordering 10, 11 times. Like, there's people ordering 22 times, 32 times. I'm like, what are they eating the products? It was wild. Sorry, that's my dog. What's wrong? So I think, that's an example for me of a brand that took a little while to really find its footing. And I think it's the next touch. I think it's like the Tatcha of Ayurvedic beauty. It's a great product, and she's having her moment now. You know what I mean? Like that's an example. Another example would be Everest, which launched at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. It's a hair care concentrates brand. And they initially launched with, more of their messaging around sustainability and the fact that, in your shampoo, in your shower, probably 90% of it is water. And you think about shipping that all over the world and the carbon emissions and that footprint, and just the environmental sustainability angle was something they really, really led with. And I think they realized very quickly, in the first year or so that they needed to lead with performance. And then they reformulated their product, their conditioning product. They in the last 6 months, they've experienced explosive growth. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on it. Hopefully they don't kill me, but I don't think they will. But they've year to date. I know this because I know this business very well. But year to date, their sales are up 8 to 9 times over the same period last year. I'm honestly, Mike, I'm looking at these numbers and I'm like, is this 2007? Like, the more they spend on digital spend, their CAC comes down. I'm like, what is this, 2017? Like, I don't understand.
It's real. It's real.
Playback. Like, this is wild. How is your CAC coming down? I don't understand. But it's the fact that they've found their groove. It took them a while to find the right messaging. They did have to iterate on the product, right? That happened at the end of 2022. And now, I would say from about November 2023 to now, they've unlocked explosive growth. And that's so cool to see as an investor and as somebody that's been following. I mean, I only invested at the beginning of 2023, but I'd been following this brand since they launched. Like I remember like DMing them, like I was right in there, and so it's so cool to see as someone, that's so those I'm attracted to opportunities like that. Now another investor might say to you, the opposite of that, where I like to see quick traction. I like to see out of the gates. This was, like she blew up on TikTok and like
Viral,
this
yeah.
and that
Virality
viral.
around
Like
the product,
my
yeah.
experience, I've always felt this way, especially when it comes to celebrity, TikTok, influencer. All of those things scare me a lot because I think you're quick to rise and you can be quick to fall. We live in this like terrible cancel culture world today, and like it's just like if your brand is so like becomes notorious and almost like fake, like it like that really actually scares me. Like I want to see more longevity.
I also with celebrity led brands, you also, I mean, as you pointed out, you certainly have risk as well when it comes to you could have risk, right? When it's someone kind of the face of the brand, right? We've also seen, you know, um, risk as well when it's a founder, maybe the face of the brand, and maybe wasn't a celebrity before, but the brand very much is part of their DNA. What do you think? Does that also maybe scare you in the same way? Or do you like to see like the founder maybe a bit more behind the scenes of the brand? How do you think about that kind of relationship? I would say with an individual and the brand itself.
Yeah, it's such a good question because in a way, I think a big piece of brand will come down to the founder, especially in the early stage, right? And not just in terms of consumer like focus, but it's you're building your team, you're building like it's so founder led, right? So I understand the inclination for founders, rightfully so, to be more front and center. I do just feel that the brand and the products and everything else need to stand on their own, right? So um, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If you drill into like Everest is a great example. Like, I think maybe I've only ever seen like one or two ads of Jamie and Jess, but it's before and afters of the hair. This is what your hair looks like before Everest. This is what, like, like same with Sahajan. Like Lisa's, you know, you she leads very much with her product, and she certainly has a pharmaceutical background, and that comes out in her. And she's very authentic. I mean, her family is from Kerala, which is like the epicenter of Ayurveda in India, right? It's that region of India where a lot of Ayurveda retreats happen, all that kind of stuff. So I don't know. It is a good question. I think there is always a bit of risk in too much of that, though.
Yeah, I think it makes sense in terms of like, especially when you're kind of getting the brand off the ground. Like I love looking at, the about pages and kind of like the story of the brand, right? And that
So
I
important,
feel like
right?
that has to have, yeah, you have to be, a storyteller, even if you're not, in a video or anything like that. Like there has to be a really, really kind of compelling story, in my opinion, in terms of why you exist. And typically that, involves, the founder, right? It's going to involve like a person. I mean, because that's also I think how we make connections too, right? In terms of like connecting with the brand in the early on. But I can also understand as you kind of go up and you move on up, why as well that also might be something that you have to be careful with as well and also manage. Um, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, like I'm trying to think, have I ever invested in a brand where the name of the founder was like I'm like, I don't think I ever have. Like I'm trying to I'm sort of saying them out loud in my head right now. And yeah, I worry about stuff like that. But then again, listen, I mean, I think in beauty as well, like especially on some of the things that are like dermatologist back, like Dr. Barbara Sturm and Dr. Dennis Gross, and like I think there's sometimes like you need to, right, like lean on the founder in a big way for a brand. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. How do you think? Seems like now in the world of consumer, seems like beauty and personal care are just everyone wants to invest in beauty and personal care. Like I've talked to I know we've kind of spoke about this a little bit before, but it seems like investors that maybe typically traditionally would be investing in food and beverage brands also have evolved in terms of their thesis to maybe include beauty and personal care. I'd love to kind of hear first of all why beauty and personal care is interesting to you in the world of consumer. What is interesting about those types of brands, how they operate, and even breaking down maybe some of like the economics of the business. And two, if you've seen this shift, and if so, why you've seen this shift.
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I'm biased because of the 10 investments that my own vehicle has made, like direct investments that I've made in the last, 12 to 18 months. 6 of them have been in beauty. So I don't know if you're going to get like a biased answer here. Like maybe I'll just answer from my perspective, like what's attracted me to beauty. Look, I think the first thing, and just to be super honest, I only did my first beauty deal in 2021. At the beginning of 2021, I led the seed for Iris and Romeo when I was a venture partner of another firm, and that was my first foray into beauty. I'd done no beauty before then, and so like I'm relatively new too. So I'll caveat with A, I'm biased. I'm on that train of recent interest in beauty, and B, I've only been in that category for a few years, admittedly. But from my perspective as an investor, I've been really attracted to the economics of the underlying business. I've been really attracted to. So when I say that, I mean margins are quite a bit higher. I like we talked about this with food. Like food hurts, right? For the most part, it's so I've been really attracted to the overall like business model in terms of margins. I've been really attracted to the loyalty that you'll find within personal care and beauty. So that's been a point of interest. I would also say as an investor, many of us, especially within consumer, not me, but I know many of my consumer investor friends, sometimes they're still sitting on things that they've invested in from like 2015, 2016, and they're like, maybe it'll sell one day. I don't know. Like maybe there's a buyer, maybe it's like investors I think are becoming increasingly focused as they should be on their exit. And the beauty and personal care industry happens to be one where there just so happen to be a lot more acquirers than the food and beverage space, as an example, just as a comparable. And so with a larger set of potential acquirers. So
when you say acquirers, excuse me, do you mean like active acquirers, like they're actually going out and actually are interested in terms of acquiring versus like the actual number of
like their business model is to add to their portfolio and add business like that. That's what they do. They're a large conglomerate. They're a Unilever. They're Puig. They're you name it. They're looking to acquire brands, right? And the other interesting aspect of the exit dynamic that I've seen anyway is that you don't need to be too large for that to happen, right? So in terms of scale, the scale that you need to get to, in my opinion, that I've seen is anywhere between 50 and 100 million. You're already in a bit of a sweet spot. I was speaking to another investor the other day that just led the deal for a business that was just announced today. And she was telling me in the scope of her research, she was like, and it was her first beauty deal too. And she was like, I was amazed to see how many acquisitions happen between 20 and $40 million of sales. And you don't really hear about it on Beauty Independent or Business Fashion or Glossy or any of these publications because they're so small, but exits do happen. And so that was interesting to me because there just isn't as much public data on that. But through the course of her research, she had shared that with me, and I found that really fascinating. So yeah, I would say the exit dynamics are certainly a reason why. I think a typical consumer investor may have not seen the returns they would have liked to see in apparel, or food and beverage, or some of these other consumer categories. However, the dynamic is such that there just are a lot more options for exit from an acquisition standpoint in beauty and personal care.
How do you think about the overall trajectory of a beauty personal care brand? Because as you say, like the exit maybe is happening earlier than you would expect sometimes. Still, of course, from the investor standpoint, you want to have like an outsized return, right? How should a founder or what you've seen in terms of to get to maybe, for example, like 40 million, let's say, or 50 million revenue, that trajectory in terms of fundraising, what does that typically look like from your mind? And are those kind of discussions that you have with founders in terms of what you before you invest, in terms of in terms of what they um when they actually should next fundraise, or if they even want to continue fundraising?
Yeah, I mean, I think the decision to fundraise and when to do it is so company specific and brand specific, and it depends on, all sorts of other things in terms of where they've gotten to. Um, yeah, like Sahajan, for instance, is a great example. She completely bootstrapped, from 2015 until last summer, right? 2023. Yeah, 8 years, right? Which is incredible. But she built a profitable business from day one. And fine, maybe she didn't have like 0 to 1 million in the first year, right? But she very like intentionally, very carefully, grew the business and didn't need to. And when I convinced her to raise capital and she went on the journey, yeah, like I mean, I think she's in a great spot. She'll do a Series A soon, and that might be her last round. And that's because she's built just a really profitable business, and that's great. But not. It depends on your structure. It depends on your margins. It depends on for certain profitability when you've gotten there, how you've gotten there. It depends on how much of your business is D2C versus retail as well. I think in her case, like she's been in retail since for the last several years in Credo and Detox Market and some smaller accounts. Sephora is her first big account, but fortunately she has a really sizable D2C business, right? Which if you can nail down the economics, especially with loyalty and repeats and stuff like that, like it's pretty like it's like that piece of it can be, if you have that piece of it in your business model, even as you go into retail, that might cushion some of the cash requirements or working capital and inventory and all those other things. So in her case, her trajectories looked like bootstrap for 8 years, a sort of pre-Series A round, and then a Series A, and I think she might be done, right? So in her case, she will have probably at the end of the day, I'm guessing. I hope she doesn't mind me speaking so publicly about her brand. I should have checked with her before. But in her case, I could see by the end of the day her raising less than 10 million for sure, and achieving a 9-figure exit.
This episode is brought to you by Propeller Industries. If you run a high-growth business and you're focused on profitability, extending your runway, and improving your operational efficiency, you probably need a finance and accounting whiz that will grow with you. Well, instead of hiring someone full-time, what would be cost-effective is working with Propeller Industries. Propeller Industries is a leading strategic finance and accounting partner for venture-stage companies and has partnered with over 1,000 startups and high-growth businesses across consumer products, consumer tech, and enterprise. Some of the brands that they've worked with are Liquid Death, Olipop, Hims, Farmer's Dog, Away, MoviePass, and Giphy. Propeller also provides specialized support for fundraising and M&A with transaction advisory services. Propeller's TA team of former investment bankers and investors can step in on more of a project basis when pursuing full-scale financing and M&A. There's a link to Propeller Industries in the show notes if you want to learn more information. How also do you think about well, I guess when we talked a little earlier, we talked about sleepy categories and or sleepy kind of companies that are kind of slow to kind of get the ball rolling or the revenue to come in the first couple of years, maybe because they're a bit early to the category. How do you within beauty and personal care, how do you think about today, maybe what are some of the sleepy categories or categories that you think are potentially overlooked?
It's interesting as I look at my beauty portfolio, in specific, the one underlying theme, I would say, and maybe just with one exception, but for the most part, I've been really attracted to brands that have gone after women in their power years. That's a category that I feel has often been overlooked. Women that are 40 plus happen to have the capital to spend, happen to be extremely loyal when they find something, are like it's so it's interesting that I think I don't think it's the case anymore. I think people have clued in the last probably year or two in particular. But when I started my journey in beauty as an investor, I was certainly seeing that there was more white space in that category of demographic, regardless of category. Whether it's color cosmetics or skincare, or like I definitely think that continues to be a little bit of an overlooked overall category. But I think that there have been a number of entrants as well, so I think that's lessening more and more.
Because you have so much experience investing in companies that start off D2C and e-commerce, does that have to be a must-have for you, or or can they start in retail wholesale? I know from like I imagine from like a data perspective, it's obviously D2C. You just have so much information when it comes to customers and loyalty, and are able to kind of put it in cohorts and what have you. But do you also consider like companies that maybe start out wholesale?
Yeah, I I think wholesale needs to be part of the playbook if there is a playbook. I just maybe I'm old school in this regard, but I do really think that building your brand, knowing your consumer as well as you can know your consumer, you're just not going to get that level of insight unless you launch direct. So I'm a big fan of soon thereafter starting to look into retail and wholesale and diversifying your business and growing your channel mix early on. But I do just think that there's so much that you can learn, and then like Everest is a great example, right? 85% of their business right now, I think, is still D2C, and they've experienced extremely like a crazy amount of growth in the last little while. But they know their consumers so well now, and I think they can use that to better serve their customer within retail channels as they start to grow that out as well. Like, does that make sense? Like, I think there is something about if you can do it and if you can do it profitably, I think you end up learning a lot about what you need to do to really find that product market fit when you own your customer data.
Yeah, no, that makes sense in terms of why for you as well. In order to be comfortable, it makes sense to have that data and to have hopefully a decent amount of data, 500K to a million in sales at least. But that's the hope. What happens if, and has this ever happened to you before, when you source a company, you like the company, you get to due diligence, and maybe there's a red flag in due diligence? What's if this has happened, what's an example of a red flag once you get to that point?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's one that comes to mind, um, and it's when and if I ever get the inkling that the customer is not like the core, you know? Like, I think that how you deal with your customers very, very, very early, and I'm talking like sub $1 million even in sales, like sub even $500,000 in sales, um, is going to say a lot about like the team, the founder, core values, and whether or not they are here to exist for their consumer. And I have had there's one instance in particular where there's a product quality issue. I came to discover it. They were honest with me and told me about it, and it wasn't the fact that there was a product quality issue. There's always going to be product quality issues when you scale from 10,000 to 500,000 to 10 million. Like, hell, like when did see-through pants happen for Lululemon? That was when they were at $1 billion, right? Like, in sales, like there's like something's going to crack as you scale to higher levels. Like, product quality issues, like that's always going to be a thing. You're never going to skirt that. That's not the issue. The issue is how you communicate that to your consumers. It's how you deal with that, and the interesting in that specific instance, I remember the founder and the company, they're telling me, so this is affecting like 20%, this issue where something shows up to your home and it's not in the way that it's supposed to be packaging, whatever. But it's like not usable, right? Like it's like this product was no longer usable. Okay. And they were getting complaints they were saying 20% of their customers they're shipping to in a certain region. And I was like, okay, so what are you doing about it? And the answer is we're fixing it. In the background, we're changing up the packaging, whatever. But yeah, that's what we're doing about it. And I'm like, no. What are you doing to communicate to your consumers that you've shipped a product to where already you're getting 20% of your customers. 20%, that's a big number. That's not insignificant. That's not immaterial. Are coming to you and saying like, hey, this showed up unusable, right? And they didn't have an answer for it. They're just like, no, we're just going to fix it. And when somebody complains, we'll deal with it. We'll give them, gift card, a promo code to use on their next purchase. And that just wasn't good enough for me, Mike, because I was like, if 20% of your customers are actually putting up their hand and saying, hey, this happened, you've got to believe that there's probably another 20% at least that may not go through the trouble. Like, I'm probably that consumer where if it shows up to my home unusable, like, I'm too busy with my life and my day-to-day, like, you'll just never see me again. You'll never see me again. And the thing about consumers and consumer experience is you're going to rave about a great consumer experience. And similarly, you will tell everyone you know about a consumer experience that's really shitty. Am I allowed to say that word? I don't know. Okay. You will. You will. That's just how we work as humans. You remember the best, you remember the worst, right? And that was just so telling to me because, they had an opportunity in that moment to get ahead of something and to be proactive and to reach out. I mean, it wasn't even a ton of orders yet. They were let's call it $500,000 in sales. Like you could have very proactively reached out to a subset of consumers that you knew were probably affected by an issue that was your response, that, you failed on and that you're fixing. And you just you're choosing not to. And that tells me that the consumer isn't at your core. And that tells me a lot about your core values as a business, as a founder. And these are things that I do look for. And I think that anybody that knows consumer well enough should look for them too, because the problems aren't going to go away. Like it's like I said, you could be $1 billion in revenue and you'll have a product quality issue, but it's how you deal with those challenges. And it sets the tone for the culture of your firm.
Totally. I mean, yeah, I mean, certainly, not just kind of deal with it on like an individual basis and like make it right, but actually say, okay, there's actually something really wrong here with our manufacturing, or there's really something with our fortune. Which, by the way, I mean, manufacturing is freaking hard, right? Like building physical, inventory based businesses, like it's freaking hard. And I do think that consumers, even if they love your product, and maybe if the product doesn't, if you buy it again and maybe it's not quite right of what it used to be, I do think if you came out as a company like, hey, like we're a young company, right? We're trying to fix this. We've seen actually so many orders that this is becoming concerning. Like it's no longer a rounding error, right? That we want to make this right, and you kind of go a bit public with it. Then at the same time, that actually could inspire even more loyalty in some ways, right? So that people, it's that transparency, it's that honesty that that like this is the position that your company is in, but at the same time, also being honest that you're also a startup, right? So
Yeah,
you're also like a very young company.
Retention is so hard. I think people are focusing more and more on it today. But in that first instance where there is what you consider a high probability of a poor experience, if you can't get ahead of that right away, don't even try and retention style win them back in 6 months. Like they're done, right? Like for the most part, right? That's my view. That's what I've seen anyway.
Yeah. I mean, you can convince someone to buy something once, right? But buying it the second time, if it's not a great experience, they're probably not going to buy it the second time, right? So that first impression is huge. If that first impression doesn't go right, you need to get ahead of it.
And the irony is you've spent so much money on that first, in the era that we live in right now, knowing what we know about, acquisition, like it's hard to acquire that customer. And so, yeah, if you have an opportunity to make things right really early on, I don't see why you wouldn't take your shot.
Totally. Also, like, just you've had such an incredible experience on the investment side. I know now you're Topknot venture and active angel. Is that fair? Is that like
on brand?
Yeah, no, exactly. And like a very active angel. What have you learned as well from investing with others? Investing with others too. I know that you obviously co-invest with other people, and you've also seen funds and kind of partnership dynamics. What have you learned about maybe co-partner dynamics and when it comes to actually starting to fund, for those that are actually interested in starting to fund, how to actually choose the right co-founder or pick the right people they actually should want to work with?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I mean, here's what I've learned. I've learned that at the outset of any formal business relationship, including but not limited to, but especially in regards to starting a GP, like starting a fund, you just need to have really clear roles, responsibilities, lanes. You know, you need to have a proper framework of how to deal with, you know, differing opinions and adversity, right? And I think having that framework set up early on, having those clear roles, responsibilities, I think is crucially important. I mean, when I was raising my first fund with 3 other partners, I wish we had more of those conversations, you know, and expectations early on, and that framework early on, and yeah, how you deal with conflict of interest, you know, that sort of thing. Like, I think those are all really important conversations to have. They're not fun conversations. They're not, right? Like, it's like a prenup, essentially. Like, when is that ever fun, right? But I think they're really important. I mean, the reality is a lot of people come together to start funds, and it's like, I've known them for years, and we've had this working relationship, and we've been at this company together for 10 years, and then we've stayed in touch, and this and that, and that's great, but you've never come together to, you know, raise other people's money, right? Third-party capital, to invest in potentially what is a very unique strategy, right? So it's the first time that you're doing this, and I think, yeah, that would be my advice. Just setting all that up, having those tough conversations early.
What's the end goal for Topknot Ventures? Is it eventually gonna? Are you eventually? Is it always gonna be investing off the balance sheet and angel investing? Is it? Are you gonna be thinking about bringing out LPs and also bringing out partners? Not that you need to bring on partners if you have LPs, but what do you believe is kind of like the end goal with Topknot?
You know, it's so funny. I talk about this a lot. You know, most people start their investing journeys and they start as angel investors, and then they'll maybe work for like a small firm, and then they'll work for like a really big firm, and then they'll like, you know, then they'll have their own firm, like, you know, they'll sort of do that. Whereas like my life has been the opposite, where I started my career like in investment banking, like advising big companies on how to buy other companies, and you know, a lot of M&A, and then I was in private equity for 5 years, where it was like big, huge companies, like big acquisitions, right? And then I started my own venture capital firm with 3 other partners, and then I worked for family office, and then venture partner role, and now I'm like, I'm not at the end of my career. I'm only 42, but you know, now I've sort of landed angel investing, and first of all, I'm having the most fun I've ever had. That's like one thing that's just true. And I'm having the most impact I've ever had, which is the second piece of it that gets me really excited about what I'm doing now. And I'm getting to finally kind of come into my own and trust that instinct that I've developed over the last 2 decades. And, you know, I'm not having to convince 3 people across the table or a partner in the, like, I'm sort of getting to make my own decisions, and certainly, like, I have many friends in the consumer investing business that have their own funds and are doing great, and I'll often text with them, ask them questions. So I'm collaborative still in nature in that regard, but I'm getting to make my own decisions, and I'm really enjoying that, to be honest. And will I ever raise another fund? I may not. You know, I think that I was fortunate in the sense that I worked really hard at it too, but I was able to return back a bunch of capital to my investors. So I was able to close out my fund and actually give back DPI, right? We talked about this. Like, I'm one of the few funds out there that raised a fund in the last decade and that actually like gave back all the money and a bit of a profit in the last, like, you know, so like I've done that. So I fortunately have great relationships with many of the LPs and investors that were in my prior fund, and many of them ask me often enough, because I'll bring them into deals that I do, and they'll be like, when are you actually just raising a fund so I can just like write you, like sign a subdoc and like
make it easy, yeah.
Make it easy
yeah.
for me. And I'm like, with all due respect, I will never be beholden to investors again. Like I will not, like with all due respect, like thank you for the vote of confidence, but I just, it's a lot of responsibility, Mike. At the end of the day, when you're raising a fund, when you're deploying other people's capital, like it's an incredible responsibility. And I've lived through it, and I've done it, and and I'm grateful for the experience. And maybe I will do it again. But for now, I'm kind of having fun where, quite frankly, like I said, most people start their investing careers in this little pool that I'm in, and I'm having a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think I remember talking to an investor and asking how this person's weekend was, and it was, on Sunday it was all day chatting with an LP. So I'm just saying that you also have that too. So it's and because sometimes I think that VC funds, incredible vehicles, incredible, create such incredible value in especially the world that we both care about, and on the consumer side of things. But at the same time, I think it's sometimes also all the things that you kind of think about with consumer funds, the fun stuff like deploying capital and stuff like that. There's also all the back end stuff to deal with too, with uh, the LPs and managing that too, and also like the partner dynamics as well, or the actual building the actual fund from scratch, which is incredible. But it's just also something to think about if you were to start a fund too.
Totally. I mean, I had this conversation with someone the other day, another investor who has his own fund now. He's on fund two, and he joked about it. He's like, whenever I have somebody that comes to me and asks me about investing, they really want to invest, they want to go build their own firm, I just tell them, no, just go be a partner in another fund and invest. If you want, like, because when you develop your own firm, like your job isn't just investing anymore. That's like a small part of your job now. You're really you're managing other people's money now, and your relationships, and your customer is actually your own LPs and your own investors. Whereas, like, for me, like I don't have that anymore, and I don't really miss it. I should say I love all my investors. Honestly, I've been so fortunate, right? Like I do deals now. Like I'll participate in deals anywhere from like $1 million on the smallest side up to $8 million has been my largest deal that I've supported and helped. And like honestly, like I'm able to call on those relationships, whether they be through funds that I've interacted with, or whether funds that I have relationships with, all the new funds that I'm developing relationships with, but also just the LPs that were in my fund will often show up as co-investors in companies that I'm investing in and leading rounds for now. And so I'm so grateful for those relationships. I am, but yeah, I think I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing right now for a while.
Cool. And just quickly, napkin math in terms of what your kind of expectations are when you kind of underwrite into a company, in terms of how much typically is your average check size? When do you want to? How long do you think duration that you're actually in the company for? And what is the desired kind of return, or the hope that the return will be from that investment?
Yeah. So great question. So my initial entry point, I mean, it's changing. But yeah, typically anywhere from like 10 to 30, 40K, and then flexing up to 50 to 100K. Like if like in follow-ons, like including, like the next round, if I can get it. I'm just a small investor. But when I think about underwriting an investment, I mean, it's consumer, right? I think I'm underwriting for, a 5 to 10x is the sort of the range. And in aggregate, I know I'm going to have losses as well. That's inevitable. The nice thing about consumer from a loss ratio perspective, especially if you can play a more hands-on role, it's typically less than the average tech, but I'm still, even just my own I have my own little fund model. Like I'm still kind of underwriting for, anywhere from like on the low end, 20 to 30%, but up to 50% loss ratio is what I'm forecasting for my own fund. Like it's just going to happen. Right. So yeah, I'm hoping for my own portfolio. I'm giving you a lot of math here, but I'm hoping for my own portfolio, if I end up doing between, sort of 3 to 4x, like that's a great return for a portfolio, in my opinion, in consumer early stage.
Totally. I agree. My final question to you: what is one book that inspires you personally, and one book that inspires you professionally?
let's see. I'm a big fan of audiobooks. So recently, I have to almost like open it up and check. So my all time, like one of my favorite like professional ones, I'll start with that one, is The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which I will actually like, I'll listen to chapters of that again. And I know it's an old school book, but I just find it like super, super insightful, and real and true. So that would be the professional one. The personal one, I'm really into like biographies and stuff. I'm really into, hearing. So I don't know if that's also professional, but I recently, Kara Swisher, I heard her audiobook and I found it fascinating. It was her sort of biography, and I think it came out a couple months ago. So that's probably been the latest one that I read. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but I got through it within like a few days. I go for walks with my dog and put my AirPods in, and I just found her perspective really fascinating as someone that's covered, the emerging tech scene as a reporter, and her insights were interesting and very entertaining, and the gossip on the various players, everyone from Steve Jobs to Elon Musk and stuff. So I found that really entertaining. So that would probably be like my personal bucket and something that I've read recently, or listened to recently, I should say.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for these. This is great. I have one more final question for you. I know you're Canadian, and I know that you invest in American companies. You also invest in a lot of Canadian companies. Make the case. Why is Canada such an incredible place when it comes to investing in like beauty and personal care companies?
We got to try so much harder. I mean, like, that's the thing about Canadian. No, but it's true, right? Like, we're a tenth of your size. But if you think about it, as an emerging brand, we're having to like control spend on 2 geographies out of the gates, right? Like, that's an interesting one. So we're very disciplined. I think from that perspective, we're very measured in our approach. I think what can hurt us, in my opinion, has really helped a lot of founders, which is like the Canadian conservatism. Like, we're more conservative for the most part, just a little bit, especially when it comes to risk taking. And I don't know if that's always a bad thing from an entrepreneur standpoint. I mean, when I think about my portfolio of beauty brands, like Bloom, Everest, Sahajin, Blanca. Yeah. So like, I mean, I'm really happy with my Canadian beauty founders anyway. Like, I think we have to work harder. And I think that's not a bad thing, right? We're not in New York, we're not in LA, we're not in the epicenter, right? It's like, we're kind of a little bit of the underdog sometimes. But we work really hard for our wins. And, I think we're good people.
Not just saying this, every Canadian I've met have just been like the nicest people. Including you. Yeah. Love Canadians. And also I'm also a big ice hockey fan, so that also probably helps. Manica, thank you so much for your time. This has been so much fun.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
And there you have it. It was a pleasure having Manica on the show. Manica, thanks again for coming on. If you're loving this show, please consider subscribing to the newsletter at theconsumervc.com. You'll receive all the latest fundraising updates in the world of consumer, and you'll be the first to know when a new episode drops. Thanks for listening.